Hello Horror Hounds, welcome back to our third and final look at Michio Yamamoto's so-called Bloodthirsty Trilogy, three Japanese vampire movies from the early 1970s. We've talked about The Vampire Doll, Lake of Dracula, and now it is time for Evil of Dracula. Just as Evil of Dracula is at the tail end of this trilogy, it's not just the Western vampire traditions that Yamamoto is pulling on, but also perhaps the sense of desperation to remain relevant that marked out Hammer's own latter-day vampire movies. A watered-down lust for a vampire as an influence set in a girls' school. The violence is ramped up a little bit. And just like Hammer's final vampire movies, the opportunity to incorporate some nudity is not lost in an attempt to get bums on seats. Arriving at the Saimai Girls' School to take a job as a psychology professor, Mr. Shiraki meets the principal of the school, who has lost his wife in a car accident a few days before. Now, we learned in the first film, The Vampire Doll, that death by off-screen car crash is actually shorthand for vampire. And in short order, Shiraki is told that he's being lined up to be the next principal of the school, where one or two girls normally go missing each year. It's no big deal. Can he save the girls under his care, and can he uncover why accepting the position of principal hasn't worked out so well for previous candidates? This third and final film is perhaps a case of more being less. With each film, Yamamoto added more character and more plot. The Vampire Doll seems very sparse in comparison to these second and third films. I think he hit a kind of sweet spot with plot and character in the middle film, Lake of Dracula. In Evil of Dracula, there are many more characters, much more backstory, more blood, even some nudity, and yet it all feels slower and somehow slighter than its predecessors. The nudity especially feels mostly chunked in on top of many elements that are remixed or reused from the previous two films. By the third film, Yamamoto is already cannibalizing the first two films in the trilogy, and that's not really a great sign. By the time we get to the now traditional excessive battle sequence, it feels like it's an effort to reach just the 80-minute mark. The fight with the vampire goes on much longer, is more extravagant with more stunts, but it seems like it's out of desperation or a need to impress rather than by design. However, it is saved by a quite remarkable revelation towards the end, which shows how these vampires have been able to remain at the school undetected for its 81-year history, and probably for a lot longer than that. We are treated to a third original, quite unique take on the source of the vampire contagion. The idea of vampirism as a European trait entering Japan was insinuated into the plot of Lake of Dracula. In Evil of Dracula, Yamamoto doubles down. The backstory and the final revelation of how that links to the modern day events is easily the most interesting aspect of Evil of Dracula. The only problem is it all comes after the fact. You fill in the blanks after the film's ended, so perhaps a second viewing will be more satisfying for me. In Evil of Dracula, vampirism reaches the shores of Japan in the form of a European Christian priest who is shipwrecked on the island some 200 years ago. At that time, Christianity was outlawed in Japan, so he was tortured to the point of denouncing his God and spitting upon the cross. He was banished into the desert where he had to drink his own blood to survive, and eventually became a demon, passing on his vampire curse to his first victim. That origin finds a nice echo many years later, I think, in Bram Stoker's Dracula, where it's an act of ultimate blasphemy that is required to turn Vlad Dracul into the immortal vampire Dracula. Rikiro Manabe scored all three films, and as with the other two, the score again is lackluster. It pulled me out of the film rather than accentuating it. Jazz flute is a bold choice, but perhaps not best suited to a horror film score. I mentioned it in my review of The Vampire Doll. I appreciate no one is going to pony up the cash, but if anyone were to write original scores for all of these three films, someone like Philip Glass, I think they'd play even more like gangbusters. Each of the three films in this trilogy boast a bloody denouement, and Yamamoto does leave the most extreme moments for the finales of these films. With Evil of Dracula, he really pushes the envelope of what had been done in the previous two films. I don't want to give any of it away because it really is shocking. It really does work extremely well, offering a finely poised balance between showing graphic violence tempered with some actions being shown in shadow only, but somehow that sudden distance from all the gory stuff we'd just been shown makes the proceedings even more striking and effective. While we were watching the film, my girlfriend and I very definitely thought that Evil of Dracula was the lesser of the three. She favours Lake of Dracula. I'm torn between placing that or The Vampire Doll at the top of the list. One thing I can say for definite, though, is that even the least of these three movies has something to recommend it. I watched the quite astonishing finale revelation of Evil of Dracula with my mouth actually agape, and that never happens. It's certainly a shame that Yamamoto didn't direct any more films after this. Evil of Dracula was his final feature, although he did a couple of bits in TV afterwards. But he's left us with the Bloodthirsty Trilogy, a trio of vampire films that are perhaps remixes of more famous vampire flicks, sometimes remixes of each other. None are perfect, but each film lingers in the memory for different reasons. All three will definitely get a rewatch in my House of Horror. I think they'd each go really nicely in a double bill with some of Hammer's less lauded vampire films like Brides of Dracula, Twins of Evil, or Vampire Circus. If you've watched the Bloodthirsty Trilogy, please tell me what you think. If you haven't seen it, I've tried to tread lightly around all three so as not to spoil them. They're definitely pieces, perhaps, of mood and eeriness, punctuated especially towards the end with graphic violence. And it's an approach, especially with the Japanese flavours added to it, that have really struck me, perhaps not whilst watching, but since watching them. I kind of want to go back and watch them again. It definitely won't be long before all three are played out again in my house. I just don't think I'll necessarily watch them all back to back. I might drop them in with other more familiar films to just add a little kick of the unusual, the slightly strange again. But if you haven't checked them out and you're planning to do so, I really, really hope you enjoy them. Thank you.